It's quite common to use callback commands, also known as delegate commands or relay commands, when implementing MVVM commands in WPF. And that's just any type of command that takes in an action or a function callback and executes that callback when the command gets executed. But today I want to show off an alternative approach to using callback commands because some people actually only use callback commands. And I'm not saying callback commands are bad, but I think you should consider this alternative approach because there's definitely some benefits to using this approach over callback commands. But I'm not saying they're bad. I think they're definitely good for simple use cases. Let's not get all religious about callback commands versus other methods. But let's take a look at the issues with using callback commands. So I have this application here, and let's go ahead and actually run this, and I'll show off what we got. So we have this buy little section of the screen over here where we can select an item and select our quantity. We'll type in 3. Then we'll calculate the price. Okay, $1.47. Alright, I'll buy these 3 apples. And then we can come over to the sell panel over here and select our apples, which we just bought. And we'll put in our quantity, calculate the price. Alright, 98 cents. Let's sell those. Okay, we sold the apples. Now this is actually split into 2 separate view models. So we have a sell view model over here and a buy view model over here. Let's see that in the code, okay? So main view model contains our buy view model and our sell view model. And let's look at each of these view models. So on our buy view model, we have a couple of commands here. One to calculate the price and one to buy whatever items we selected. And we saw that in the UI, the buttons that map to these commands. And then we actually implement these commands using callback commands. So we have a method to calculate the price here. As you can see, we calculate the price, do some stuff with the messages, calculate it, set the status message, or set an error message if there was one. And then we have a buy method as well, where we buy the items. Now let's come into the sell view model, and as you can see, we have similar commands, except now we have a sell command instead of a buy command, of course. And for the calculate price command, that's a callback command, and we have the same calculate price logic. It's just duplicated between both of our view models. And we really ended up duplicating this because we used callback command, and we had to implement a calculate price method in each of our view models. So what is the alternative? How can we get rid of this duplication? Because really our main goal is to just have one calculate price command and not have to implement it in each of our view models. So how are we going to reuse this? What is the alternative? Well, quite simply, we're going to create an actual command, not using callback command, called the calculate price command. And we are simply going to implement the iCommand interface on here. So let's import that, implement the interface. We'll go ahead and make this public. So really all we're going to end up doing is, instead of using callbacks and passing them into a callback command, we're going to have classes for our commands. And let's see how this is going to help us reduce the duplication between our view models. So we're going to start off by just implementing this command for our buy view model. So let's go ahead and actually just grab everything in the calculate price method, cut that, get rid of the calculate price method actually, because we're not going to be using callbacks anymore, and move it into our execute. So there we go, and of course we get a ton of errors here. Let me go ahead and import what I need, and that is because we're trying to access these properties, but we're no longer within our view model. So we need to get our view model into this command, and we're also going to need our price service too. So let's create fields for both of those. So we're going to have our buy view model, we'll just call that view model. And then I'm going to have my price service, which is an iPrice service, and we'll just call that price service. And I'll go ahead and generate a constructor for these. There we go, looking good. And now I can just use my view model instance to just access these properties. So let's prefix all of this with the view model, pretty much everything. And there we go. So what about can execute? Well, on the buy view model, our can execute was using this can calculate price property that we have right up here. So you can calculate the price if it is a valid buy, and it is a valid buy if the item name is not empty and the quantity is greater than 0. So we're gonna grab that property in our command in the can execute method, because now we have a reference to our view model. So we can take the view model and we can execute if we can calculate the price. Now for this can execute to work, we're going to have to raise can execute changed whenever can calculate price changes. Now with callback commands, we actually never raise can execute changed because anything that subscribes to can execute changed actually just subscribes to the command manager requery suggested, and this requery suggested just gets raised whenever anything on the UI changes that might affect this command. So we actually could implement this exact logic in our calculate price command, but I want to have control over when I raise this. So I'm going to raise can execute changed whenever the view model has a property that changes. So we'll create a method for that, and we'll raise can execute changed whenever a property changes. So I'm going to put all of that event raising into its own method as well. So on can execute changed, spelled that wrong, generate that method, and inside here we'll just take our can execute changed event and invoke it with this as the sender and just a new empty event args. We don't need anything in there. And let me just move all this to the bottom of the method, not as important as the rest of the stuff in here. Alright, so there we have our command implemented. So we simply implemented the I command interface rather than using a callback command. So now we're going to actually use our calculate price command here. So let's just instantiate that. And the by view model we're going to pass in is simply this instance. And we already get a price service through our constructor, so we can just pass that into the command. And actually, I don't need this price service field either, because everything's inside the command now. So let's just get rid of that and make that a little bit cleaner. As you can see, moving things into the command classes rather than using a callback command actually cleans up our view model a lot too. So we don't have any of that logic in there. We don't have any unnecessary fields either. And now let's try this again. So we're going to select an item, put in our quantity, and there we go. We can still calculate the price. Everything still works. So now let's use this calculate price command in our cell view model. So let's get rid of the calculate price method in here, not using that anymore, and let's set up a new calculate price command. But this takes a by view model, and we are a cell view model now. What are we going to do? Well, if we look at our calculate price command, it really depends on a few things. So the view model that gets passed in needs a status message, an error message, item name quantity, and that's about it. It also needs to be an iNotify property changed, so it's got to have that event. So if that's all it needs, then we don't need to depend on a by view model. Instead, we can just depend on an interface that satisfies all of these properties and events and methods that we need. So what we're going to do is instead extract an interface out of our by view model. So let's select that. We're going to extract an interface, and this is going to be called the I calculate price view model. And let's select what we need on this interface. So we really only need what our calculate price command needs. So we don't need buyable items. Let me just deselect everything and select what we need. So we need can calculate price, error message, item name quantity, status message, and I think that's actually it. So let's extract that. And now, let me just copy this interface and go back to our calculate price command. And now we're just going to depend on this interface rather than our by view model. So there we go. And everything still works because we know whatever gets passed in is going to satisfy all of these properties except for property change. So we need to actually make sure this interface implements iNotify property changed. And now, okay, now we know we'll satisfy that event. And now that this command depends on an interface, all we need to do for this command to support the cell view model is implement the interface. So the I calculate price view model interface. So we can implement that, and we should actually already have it implemented, which I believe we do. So now we can pass this view model into the command and pass in our price service. Get rid of our price service field as well. No longer need that. So now we no longer have each of those calculate price methods in our view models being duplicated. We've moved them into a calculate price command, which takes care of all of that logic. And since we now depend on an interface that satisfies the properties and events that we need, we can support the by view model and the cell view model if they implement this interface. And actually, let's look at this interface again. And if we look at our command, we actually never get the error message or status message. So if you want like a super strict interface, you can get rid of these getters on the status message and error message. And I think we never set the item name or quantity in the command either, so you can get rid of these setters on those as well. So the interface requires a little bit less, and it'll still work. Alright, so let's go ahead and see this in action, make sure everything still works. So let's buy a shirt now, calculate the price. Alright, I'll buy that, and then let's sell. We'll sell one, calculate the price, and there we go. So our calculate price command is functioning, and we have removed that duplication. So you might be thinking really the only benefit of this is being able to reuse commands, which, you know, I really think is the main benefit, but it's also made our view model simpler because we no longer have the calculate price method in here, and I really like that because what is a view model? Well, quite simply, it's a model for the view. So our view needs a calculate price command and a buy command, so obviously we have those properties on here, but doesn't really need the implementation of those commands. So that's just something to consider. I don't want to get too religious about that. Personally, I've started to implement all of my commands as classes. It's definitely helped when debugging. Whenever I have some kind of bug, I don't have to search for my view model, scroll through my view model, try and find the method that's being executed by my command. Like now, if there's some kind of bug whenever I click the calculate price button, I usually know that I can just come over to the calculate price command and just start debugging here. So another thing I like about having my command as a class in its own file is that I can test it independently. So I set up this test real quick, and I just have my command that I want to test, the calculate price command. I set up the mocks that are specifically for that command, and then I can just write all the tests specifically for that command. Whereas with callback commands, here we have the cell view model test, and on my cell view model, I've re-implemented the calculate price method and the callback command. Now I can no longer test that command's implementation on its own. I have to actually instantiate my cell view model, and to instantiate that, I need a mock for the owned item store, which is annoying because I don't even use the owned item store inside of my command's execution. It's kind of unrelated to what we're testing. We don't actually use that mock in our calculate price command test. And of course, this doesn't seem like that big of a deal, but I guess it could be a big deal if you have to mock a bunch of things. Whereas on the calculate price command test, at most you're just going to mock everything that the command actually needs, nothing more. And another thing that's weird about these tests is that in our act stage, we take our view model, and then we take the calculate price command object and execute on that object, which kind of looks weird inside the test. It looks like we're executing code that's not even on the view model that this test class is for. But of course we know that's not the case because we're using a callback command, but it looks a little bit funkier compared to just taking the command that we're testing and calling the execute method. So that's just my take on testing. It feels a lot more natural by using commands as classes rather than callback command, but of course, it's not like this test class using the callback command is like the end of the world. It's not like it's terrible to write this, which is why I'm not going to get religious about callback command for the millionth time. So now that I've spent all this time talking about how wonderful having classes for commands is rather than using callback command, what are the drawbacks? Because there is drawbacks, I gotta be honest about that. And I think one of the potential drawbacks could be you're just gonna have more files. So now we actually have a file for our calculate price command, and not only that, we have a file for our interface for this command, so the I calculate price view model. So that's 2 extra files. And one thing you might consider to cut that down is moving this interface into the calculate price command file, because in reality this command is really the reason this interface exists in the first place. But the issue with this is that now it's in the calculate price command file, so you might not know it's here, and of course it is always nice having one class or interface per file, and this definitely breaks that rule. But maybe we could bend the rules. That's something to consider, definitely. And then even though we have this extra calculate price command file, I actually like that, because as I was saying with debugging, it's so much easier to find the logic related to calculating prices. I just click this file and everything's here. It's wonderful. Alright, and the last issue you might be wondering about is that, is this going to cause memory leaks? Because one thing that you always have to look out for is whenever you pass in some kind of object or a constructor and then subscribe to an event on that object, usually there's a risk of a memory leak, because since we subscribe to an event, this event is going to reference this method, which is on this command. So that means the lifetime of this command is dependent on the view model that gets passed in. And in that case, that's perfectly fine. So this command will get cleaned up whenever the by view model needs to get cleaned up. And of course, we can just prove this with a destructor in here. And then in the main view model, we can just set the by view model to null right away. And then put a breakpoint in this destructor, run this, and okay, we hit the destructor right away. So once the by view model gets cleaned up, the command will get cleaned up too. So no memory leaks as expected. So now that we've gone over the cons of having classes per command, which is mostly just having more files, I'm going to go ahead and implement the rest of my callback commands as class commands, just to keep pushing this idea. I really do like having classes as commands so much more. Let me know what you guys think in the comments. I mean, I promise you, I can understand either way. But before I get into implementing these commands, let's go ahead and create a base command, just to reuse some of the stuff in here. We can inherit from that base command. So let's create that base command. We'll make this an abstract class and implement iCommand. But of course, we're going to leave execute as an abstract method. Let the derived class implement that. And we'll default can execute to return true. But we'll make this virtual so that it can be overridden. And then I'm also going to grab on can execute change and just move that into the base class as well and make it protected. And now in my calculate price command, I can inherit from that. So the base command, get rid of the event, make sure we override those methods on our base class, and there we go. So let's keep extending base commands. So we're going to have a by command, and we are going to inherit from base command and implement that. So now, as you can see, now that we have this base command, all we got to do is implement this execute method. So we can just rapidly fire out each of these command implementations. Let's go into the by view model and just grab all of this, paste it into my execute. Let's get our view model in here. Not going to depend on an interface because currently the by view model is the only view model that's going to use this command. So just not going to bother with the interface. And then we also need our owned item store to add that to the constructor. And then just reference the view model for all of these properties. There we go. So back in the by view model, get rid of this method. The by command will be a new by command. Pass in this view model, and we also have to implement the can execute, which is going to depend on is valid by. So we'll have to remember to do that. And then we also have to pass in the owned item store. So we no longer need that field either. Let's get rid of that. And back in our by command, let's make sure we override can execute, and then I'll just use the view model is valid by. And then we're also going to have to subscribe to property changed. So just generate a method for that, and on the property change, we're going to call it on can execute change. Whoops, and I just tried running this. Forgot that I was setting by view model to null. Don't want to do that anymore. So here we go, make sure everything still works. We can calculate our price, and we can buy. There we go, that is perfect. And now if we look at our by view model, it just fits the definition of being a view model. It is simply a model for our view. We don't have any other logic or any methods in here. It's just got the properties and the commands that our view needs. And I think that's where I'm going to wrap this up, so I'm not going to bother with the cell view model. I think you guys should probably get the gist of it just by looking at this example view model. But overall, just to sum up, we demonstrated an alternative to using callback commands. Not a complete replacement, nothing against callback commands. I think they're still useful in simple scenarios, but implementing your commands as classes can help reduce duplication, since we showed you can reuse a command for multiple view models by just depending on an interface and having each of your view models implement the interface for the command. We also showed that testing is slightly better, not a big deal. I know some people just don't even care about unit tests either. I showed how implementing commands as classes can make the view model a lot simpler, and I even admitted to probably the biggest downside is just having more files to support the commands, which I actually like because I don't have to dig into view models to debug commands. I can just find them all over here, find the action that was having the issue, and just start debugging. So hopefully you all consider this or find it useful or interesting. But other than that, if you have any questions, criticisms, or concerns, leave them below in the comments section, and also be sure to leave a like or subscribe for more. Thank you.